In 2022, the West froze $300 billion of Russian assets. No bombs, no troops, no declaration of war, just keystrokes. Within 72 hours, Russia was cut off from SWIFT, its central bank immobilized, its oligarchs stranded. The most devastating financial attack in history, and most people didn't even notice it happening. But here's the question nobody asked. If money can be weaponized this fast, this quietly, who's actually safe? Welcome to the wealth timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. Because what happened to Russia wasn't new. It was just the latest chapter in a weapon that has been evolving for centuries, one that is older than tanks, deadlier than blockades, and almost impossible to see coming. Picture Athens, 432 BC. Sparta doesn't invade? Not yet. Instead, they issue the Megarian Decree, banning the city-state of Megara from all ports and markets controlled by Athens. No trade, no food, no survival. Megara starves. Athens escalates. The Peloponnesian War begins. This was the first recorded economic sanction in history, and it worked exactly as intended. Not by defeating the enemy in battle, but by making their existence unsustainable. At the time, this seemed reasonable, a way to avoid bloodshed. What no one noticed was the cost. Economic coercion doesn't end wars. It starts them? Fast forward to 1807. Napoleon controls most of Europe. Britain controls the seas. Neither can land a final blow. So Napoleon tries something different. The Continental system. A total blockade of British goods across Europe. If Britain can't sell, it can't fund its war machine. The logic was sound. Deprive your enemy of resources, and victory becomes inevitable. And for a while it worked. British exports collapsed. Unemployment spiked. Political pressure mounted. But the Continental system had a hidden flaw. It required total compliance. Smuggling exploded. Neutral countries profited. Allies defected. By 1810, even France was secretly trading with Britain. Napoleon's blockade didn't break Britain. It broke his own coalition. The assumption was simple. Control the flow of goods, control the outcome. It worked, but only under conditions that would not last. World War I changed everything. For the first time, blockades weren't just about ships and ports. They were about systems. In 1914, Britain declared the North Sea a military area and began intercepting all goods headed for Germany. Not just weapons, everything. Food, medicine, raw materials. Germany's industrial machine ground down. Civilian deaths from malnutrition reached 400,000. The blockade worked. Germany surrendered in 1918. And the world noticed. This wasn't siege warfare. This was economic strangulation. And it didn't require a single soldier on enemy soil. Suddenly, every major power wanted this capability. The League of Nations formalized it in 1919, embedding economic sanctions into international law. An unintended consequence, blockades became legitimate. By World War II, sanctions weren't a supplement to military force. They were the opening move. The U.S. froze Japanese assets in 1941, cutting off 80% of Japan's oil supply. Japan's response? Pearl Harbor. Temporary solution. Short-term stability. But the logic was irreversible. If you can collapse an economy without firing a shot, why wouldn't you? The stronger it became, the harder it was to stop. The Cold War introduced a new problem. Sanctions were no longer about sieges or supplies. They were about ideology. In 1960, the U.S. imposed a total trade embargo on Cuba after Fidel Castro nationalized American assets. The goal was regime change. The timeline was months. 60 years later, the embargo is still in place. Castro died in power. The regime endured. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Iran, North Korea, Iraq, Libya. Sanctions were supposed to pressure governments. Instead, they entrenched them. Why? Because authoritarian regimes don't absorb economic pain. Their populations do. And when survival is at stake, populations don't overthrow their leaders. They rally around them. By the 1990s, the data was clear. A 1999 study found that comprehensive sanctions succeeded in changing government behavior less than 30% of the time. But the warnings were ignored. Why? Because sanctions had become politically irresistible. They looked strong. They avoided war. They satisfied domestic audiences. Nothing collapsed. And that was the problem. September 11th, 2001. The U.S. responds not just with military force, but with financial architecture. The Treasury Department creates the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Within months, the U.S. begins using its control over the global banking system as a weapon. If you want to do business in dollars, which almost everyone does, you follow U.S. rules, even if you're not American. This was the true breaking point. Sanctions stopped being national policy and became global enforcement. In 2012, the US threatened to cut any bank doing business with Iran out of the dollar system. European banks complied immediately, not because they agreed with US policy, but because they had no choice. Access to dollars meant access to global finance. Losing that was financial suicide. Iran's oil exports collapsed by 60%. It worked. But it also revealed something. The US wasn't just freezing assets anymore, it was controlling the entire financial system. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. So who benefited? The United States extended its geopolitical reach without deploying troops. Financial institutions gained unprecedented power. Compliance departments became as important as intelligence agencies. And the dollar solidified its dominance as the world's reserve currency. Who absorbed the cost? Target populations, not regimes. In Iraq, UN sanctions in the 1990s contributed to the deaths of an estimated 500,000 children, according to UNICEF. Saddam Hussein stayed in power. His inner circle stayed wealthy. The cost was distributed downward, and power shifted quietly. Nations that once saw the U.S. financial system as neutral infrastructure now viewed it as a weapon they couldn't control. By 2014, Russia began building alternative payment systems. By 2015, China launched the cross-border interbank payment system, a potential rival to SWIFT. By 2020, the European Union was exploring a financial sovereignty strategy to reduce dependence on the dollar. The tool that made America powerful was now making others desperate for independence. Today, sanctions aren't just policy, they're reflex. Since 2000, U.S. sanctions have increased by over 900%, but something's changing. When Russia was sanctioned in 2022, oil prices spiked globally. Europe faced an energy crisis. Inflation hit record levels. The sanctions worked, but they hurt everyone. And, for the first time, major economies questioned whether weaponizing finance was sustainable. China and India kept buying Russian oil. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for energy sales. The system that seemed unbreakable is now being tested, not by a single rival, but by a new reality. In a multipolar world, unilateral coercion loses its power. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats incentives. And the incentive now? To build financial systems that can't be controlled by one country. Here's what history shows us about systems. The more powerful a weapon becomes, the more urgently others seek to neutralize it. About human behavior. Coercion without legitimacy doesn't create compliance, it creates resistance. Economic sanctions evolve from siege warfare into the invisible weapon of the 21st century. But the very power that made them effective is now driving the world to build alternatives. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just change how you see power itself.